it did.
I remember when they warned everybody that they were going to shorten the spacing between the seats on the aircraft. And, I mentioned that because I saw a Facebook post about y'all went to see your sister, right?
Yeah, my sister in Delaware, yeah.
Did Wayne have? He enjoyed the trip.
Oh yeah, he did. Yeah, and got him to get out of the house because he's pretty much always there. So.
Okay. All right. Today we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 26 and 27, and if everybody read my email I sent out yesterday, I kind of summarized some of the things that the last couple of chapters were covering, everything except anger. And I may come back and send out something on anger this week and about David's expression when problems that he was having. So as a review, a quick review, we saw David's attitude in chapter 24 and 25, where David got angry. He didn't pray about anything, and this was the start of David's wanting to try to handle everything on his own without asking God first. And almost every situation that he came up against prior to chapter 25, he would go to the Lord and ask him what to do. He wanted some guidance, and he would take the Lord's advice. But things changed after he ran into Nabal. And we know he was so angry he wanted to kill everybody. Literally, he strapped 400 soldiers strapped on their swords, and they were going to go wipe out Nabal and everything he had. But one of the things I've noticed, and I kind of summarize this, God's will keeps on unfolding regardless of the characters that are in play. God used Nabal, God used Abigail, God used Saul, and God used the characters who were around David. And all that was his purpose. It was to be able to produce within David the qualities and the characters of a king of Israel, what he's supposed to be. And of course, it's always up to the individual. We saw the choices that Saul made. Saul was not very good at keeping God's expectations. And David was pretty good at it for quite a while, but then he started having some problems, or he started having some issues. He didn't consult God. Now, to stay to step on Daniel's side of the carpet here, look at what he was going through. He had 600 men. We also found out that those 600 men had wives and families as well. So David was responsible for keeping those men fed and cared for, and also those families. The families may not necessarily was actually with them when they went into areas where they were in combat or fighting, but they were being supplied, or David was responsible for making sure that the families were in good conditions. And that was getting harder and harder and harder to do. So David and his men have been through putting up with Saul's antics for almost 7 years now. And you know that has a tendency to wear on you. And I think David was kind of giving up to a certain extent. But regardless of what was going on, God was still helping him. And in this first set of the chapter here, we're going to see where God still stepped in, even though David didn't consult God about what to do and how to do, or get me out of this, or resolve my issues. So David had this I attitude. He decided he wanted to handle it himself, and we look at that in chapter 24. He was under a lot of stress, and we're going to learn learn a few more things about, there were two scriptures that when Saul and his 3,000 men came after David, almost said Daniel. when they came after David, David confronted them. God gave him an advantage over Saul in those two instances, and David specifically asked, who is making these charges against me? That was in chapter 24, and in the scripture we're going to read today, he's going to ask the same question to Saul. Who are the men behind you on your court, or Abner, who was his commander-in-chief of the army? Why are you bringing these charges up against him? So David was very frustrated about this. He wanted some answers. And I don't want to get into the politics, but you know how politics works today. You've got one side against the other side, one side trying to achieve an advantage to get something done or push through Congress. There's two sides to the story. So somebody was there, what's the term? Poking the argument to Saul, and Saul, in his state of mind, which seems to be deteriorating as time goes on, he's fallen for these lies that he's hearing from his commanders and the court. And of course, he immediately jumps up and says, grab the 3,000 guys, let's go get David. So David's putting up with that kind of mentality from Saul and from his soldiers, and it's taking its toll. So let's look at, first, before we go, this is, I got this from Warren Wiersbe. And matter of fact, I picked it up from one of our old members of our class back when we were at the educational facility. And it's, why is God silent? Now, God responded to David in almost all the majority of his situations and his requests and prayers. But at the point where he ran into Nabal and had the issue with Nabal, God sent Abigail to get him out of that, because if he had done what he had wanted to do, it would have impacted his service as king when he was ordained as king. But Warren Wiersbe has a little synopsis here. I'd like to read it. What do you do when heaven is silent? What do you do when you cry out to God and there's no answer? Or at least you can't hear the answer. This happened to David. He kept crying out to God, do not keep silent, O God of my praise. And there are several Psalms. He records his attitude about this, or his feelings about this. He kept crying out to God, do not keep silent, O God of my praise. David was being attacked by wicked people. This was a highly frequent occurrence in his life. You must remember, when he prayed these prayers of judgment, he was not seeking personal revenge. No, he was praying for God's king over Israel. David wanted to see the wicked judged because they were attacking the people of God, the ones from whom God's word and his son would come from. So why is God silent in times? It may be because we aren't listening, or we do not want to listen. Evangelist Billy Sunday used to say that a sinner can't find God for the same reason that a criminal can't find a policeman. He's not looking. So he pretty much nailed that one. I like that comment he made. Sin makes us turn a deaf ear. So David was giving over to those sinful thoughts. He wants to talk to us about something, but we aren't ready. We have to go through refining trials to make us ready to listen. God is sometimes silent because he knows we're not willing to obey. Sometimes that self and that big I come out. You remember when in the Garden of Eden, after Adam and Eve disobeyed God, what was their first tendency when God came walking through the garden calling them? What did they do? They went and hid. So you you know you did wrong. You know, just like children, every one of us in there has had kids. When you know when they did something wrong, they're gonna take off, run. They don't want to get punished or something like that. That's the same thing. So God is sometimes silent because we aren't willing to obey. He's always ready to show us His will, but He shows His will only to those who really want to do it. Jesus said in John 17:17, if anyone wants to do His will, he shall know concerning the doctrine. Obedient people always hear God, the voice of God. And finally, at the end of this, sometimes God is silent that He might test us to teach us the importance of silence. The importance of waiting on Him helps. And this kind of reminds us of sovereignty. You know, God's in sovereign control of every microsecond of the day and every instance of our lives. And sometimes He doesn't want things to happen because He's waiting us to figure out His will and realize that God is sovereign. I remember when Sheila and I graduated from Mississippi State, a week later I married her. And a week later we were in a U-Haul trailer heading to Houston, Texas. And so here I was, this Mississippi redneck, given a job here in Mississippi, or given a job here in Texas. I didn't want to come to Texas because there were too many cotton-picking Texans here. And we lived on Westheimer and Gessner in an apartment complex, and the office was right down the road. And a year later, I went through training. The Lord decided He wanted us to go to Lafayette, Louisiana. We enjoyed 6 or 7 years there. And then lo and behold, the bust came in '86, and my company wanted to send me back to Texas, and there was even more Texas here 7 years later. But the Lord, and I remember thinking, I said, I have an opportunity to stay in Lafayette and work out of Broussard, and I would enjoy it. I knew the people. But God gave me an opportunity to come back to Houston. So I kind of swallowed real deep and said, okay, Lord, You lead the way. So God's will is going to work its way out, and there were a lot of people involved in on the business side for me making that final decision, and they agreed that they wanted me to go back to Houston and work in research. So that's what I did. But God was in charge of that. But so here's David's situation. Now let's start with chapter 26. And let me get this thing a little bit closer to my eyes. And the Ziphites came to Saul at Gilboa, saying, is not David hiding himself on the hill of Haliah? I have no idea how to pronounce that, which is on the east side of Jessamine. Now remember, the Ziphites had ratted on David and his men once before. So this was the second time that they went to Saul and said, we know where David's hiding, and so come on down and get him. So in verse 2, so Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with his 3,000 chosen men again of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on a hill of Haliah, which is beside the road on the east side of Jessamine. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies to learn if Saul had indeed come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. Okay, so you don't hear anything about David seeking advice from God as to how to handle the situation. There's no mention of that. And again, in all of the other verses previously, other than with Nabal, David sought God's advice. Okay, but here again, he didn't. So let's go back to verse 5. And then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay, with Abner, the son of Ner, his commander of his army. Saul was lying within the encampment while the army was encamped around him. Okay, so here's Saul's army. David sees him, and let's look what happens here. Then David said to Abimelech the Hittite and Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me into the camp to Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai went into the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground. Now remember what the spear was symbolic of Saul's authority and kingship. So wherever you saw that spear, that meant that the king was somewhere pretty close. So there Saul lay, sleeping in the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground and his head, and at his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given you your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. Okay, so put that in layman's terms was Abishai wanted to kill Saul at that point in time. He wanted to use his own spear, Saul's own spear, and stab him and pin him to the ground with his own spear. And it seems like he was trying to make it easy for David to say yes. And he said, I'll only do it with one thrust of the spear. So it'll be quick, we'll get it over with, and then we can get out of here. So that was Abishai's mindset. But David still had a little bit of common sense left to him. He knew Saul was still God's anointed. So let's go back to 8. God has given you the enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? So David still had some inner concept that Saul was God's anointed and he was there for a purpose. And verse 10, and David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. Now, David still had this mindset that that was not his responsibility to do anything like that, and the Lord didn't want that to be done. Verse 11, so the Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But now take the spear that is at his head and the jar of water and let us go. So look at the scenario here. David and Abishai snuck down into this group of 3,000 something soldiers, fully armed, top of the line, trained military people. They were all asleep. Now, what are the odds of that? Who's on guard? Who's watching? Now, and this is an army. You know, in the army, if somebody falls asleep during military conflict, they're going to be under pretty strict, especially if there's an attack or something like that. But these guys were all asleep, and here they come, sashaying down into the middle of the army and grabbing the spear of Saul and the water container of water at Saul's head. Now, Abner was right beside him. Okay, so David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep. Because, remember the deep sleep that God put Adam in when he removed that rib in order to create Eve? Well, this word sleep was the same word that was used in Genesis for that event as it was here. So all those 3,000 men plus Saul were sleeping like babies, like they had been anesthetized, and that they were put to sleep by the Lord. So even when David, and even when we don't necessarily follow what the Lord wants us to do in our life, does that mean the Lord's going to totally abandon us? No, he's going to still be there with us. And so God was with David, even though David didn't even ask him to be there. So that'll be comforting for all of us to realize that. Okay, so verse 13. So David, I think he kind of wanted to rub it in at this point. Verse 13, and David went over to the other side and stood far off on the top of the hill with a great space between them. And David called the army and to Abner, the son of Ner. Now remember, Abner is the commander of the army. And he was going to say to him, will you not answer, Abner? Then Abner answered, who are you who calls to the king? And David said to Abner, are you not a man who is like you in Israel? So David was giving him recognition for what he was. So he comes up with a question, who is like you in Israel? Why have you not kept watch over your Lord the king? Now that's a lowercase l there for Saul. For one of the people came in to destroy your king, your Lord. This thing that you have done is not good. So David's kind of getting back at Abner, because I think with the two verses that somebody in Saul's inner group was seemingly targeting David. I think that's what he probably concluded. And he wanted some answers. So verse 16, and this thing that you've done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you had failed to protect the king. Because you've not kept watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed. Now see where the king's spear is and the jar of water that was at his head. So David's sitting there holding those in his hand, and I'm sure Abner's doing a frantic search, wondering where they were. So verse 17, Saul recognized David's voice and said, is this your voice, my son David? And David said, it is my voice, Lord King. And he said, why does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now therefore let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, maybe he will accept an offering. But if it's his men, then may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Now let me do a little bit of explanation. If you have your notes, if you have an ESV Bible, you may have the same thing. Chasing the culture of Israel and the culture of those nations during those days was, if you could only worship your God in your native country that you lived in. So if a man left or was forced out to leave his country, he wasn't going to be able to worship his God, whether it was, that was just the mindset of the people during those days. So chasing David away from the Lord's heritage, which the Lord's heritage is basically Israel, so that he may have no share of it, or trying to force him to serve other gods. So David was implying is, if you're trying to run me out of Israel, you're forcing me to serve other gods based on custom. And David obviously didn't like that. It's a capital offense against the Lord of Israel, who owns the land of Israel and rules his people through his representative, the king. Those who commit this sin should be cursed before the Lord. So David's argument against Abner, if he was the one who was causing the strife between Saul and himself and David, he should be the one cursed for causing all this. He started it. Because David has yet to get an answer from either Saul or anybody as to why he was being pursued as he was for the 7 years. So we know that Saul originally wanted to protect Jonathan's future as a future heir to the king of Israel. But that wasn't God's plan, that was Saul's plan. So that's what this particular discussion here with David is. So David was not going to go serve other gods. He was going to stay there in Israel. Now therefore let not my blood fall on the earth away from the presence of the Lord. Because if you were out of Israel, their mindset thought that they were not in the presence of the Lord. So David was kind of putting Abner to test, as well as Saul. He wanted some answers, but I don't really think he ever got them fully. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more harm you. Now, how many times has Saul said this in the past? Almost with every confrontation that he had or started with David, he made promises to David. He didn't keep one of them. And David didn't trust him. He could trust him about as far as you can throw a brick. You don't trust the man. In verse 22, well, let me back up one. For I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly, and I have made a great mistake. And David answered and said, Here is the spear, O Lord. Let one of your young men come and take it. And the Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today. I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. So David is sticking to his belief in what God, he was God's anointed. And regardless of how he behaved, David was not going to shed his blood. So behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of tribulation. Then Saul said to David, Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things, and you will succeed in them. So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. So this crisis was over. And again, even though David was kind of having issues with some faith and trust in what was going on, God still stood up for him and got those guys to go to sleep. So this particular session was over, and we first start with chapter 27. I want to start next with 27. Note the first sentence that David said here. Then David said in his heart, Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. Notice the pronouns he used. I shall perish. And he said this from his heart, that one day that he would perish by the hand of Saul. So had he given up totally on the Lord helping him out? Now there were several psalms written specifically about this later on in David's life, and I'll mention those. Psalm 13. And David is basically asking the Lord, how long? Psalm 13, verse 1. How long, O Lord, will you forget? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day? How long shall my enemies be exalted over me? So I'll just read those first few verses there. So David's kind of in crisis mode. And as he used those personal pronouns, here again in 27, he didn't say anything about going to God and asking him what to do. So David, out of despair, made a decision. And let's continue reading on with that. is there nothing better for me than I should escape to the land of the Philistines? Okay, well, let's look at that statement right there. What was God's intention for the Israelites to do when they invaded the land?
Throw everybody up,
Destroy everybody. Why?
because they knew they'd be tempted and they'd intermarry with them and they'd cause trouble.
Okay, so we know, we discussed before that all of the tribal leaders of the 12 tribes, none of them obeyed God's command to wipe out everybody, man, woman, and child. Okay? Seems pretty tough, but that's what God said to do. Okay, so and the primary reason for that was God wanted to keep his people separate. He wanted to keep them from being contaminated, from intermarrying, or falling into the trap of of false gods. And that's literally what they did. If as we've gone through and studied Samuel, they had already failed in keeping that from happening. So what does David want to do? Go back and live with the Philistines, and thinking in his reasoning, that's going to keep Saul off my back. If I go and move in with the Philistines and with my soldiers and with their families, and I'll be safe for a while. Well, it appears that's how it turned out, but was that violating God's command to begin with? Now here are all his people living with the Philistines, a godless society, and we know what kind of people they were. He said, "Then Saul will despair seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." There's that big pronoun I again. No mention of God, no seeking God for an answer. So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maok, the king of Gath. Now Gath is a Philistine city. It was one of the 5 major Philistine cities near the coastline that he wanted to move into. So David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household. So this is another verse that whenever it talked about David's 600 men, it didn't include that in previous verses, but the consensus is that the families were there as well with the soldiers in previous instances in 1 Samuel. So every man with his wife, and with David his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And when it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Okay, so David still disobeyed God by commingling with the Philistines. But one thing that did come from that Saul didn't want to pick a fight with the Philistines in Gath, so he kind of left David. He kind of left him alone. And David said to Achish, I can't pronounce these words, "If I found favor in your eyes, let there be a place given for me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you?" So David again, back up in verse 5. He's trying to change the situation by moving his people out. Okay, in verse 6, so that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag had belonged to the kings of Judah. Now, that was in the Judean territory, but the Philistines had taken over that city. So Achish gave David and his men and their families the city of Ziklag. And David lived in this country of the Philistines for a year and 4 months. Okay, so in about 3 years from this point in time, maybe a little bit less, David would be the king, because Saul would perish in battle, and Ricky will tell us about that next week. So verse 8, there was an arrangement that David made between the king of Gath and his stay in their territory. And you kind of have to read between the lines. I had to at least several times to fully comprehend what was going on. Let me read verse 8. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites and the Girgashites and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land, and it would leave no man or woman alive, but would take away the sheep and oxen and donkeys and camels and garments, and come back to Achish. Well, David was lying here. He would go in and annihilate these people, but these people were under the jurisdiction of the Philistines, had treaties with the Philistines. So they were the Philistines' friends. And that's why David had to kill all these people. That was one of the reasons, is that he didn't want Achish to know this. So he was bringing all these spoils back from these raids that they were making, which buttered up Achish, thinking that David's doing me some good, and he's increasing my bank account. So, but none of these people were left alive to go back and tell Achish what actually was going on with David and his army. So, Ricky talked about a lie is a lie, a lie. That's what David was doing. He was not being truthful about why he was attacking all these people. So, when Achish asked, "Where have you made raids today?" David would say, "Against the Negeb of Judah, against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites, and against the Negeb of the Kenites." And David wouldn't leave neither man or woman alive to bring news to Gath. So these were Judean territories, and so Achish thought that he was doing all this damage to the Judeans. And so that's how David kept the secret when he went to do all this damage, because he didn't want the truth to get back to Achish, because Achish would obviously take offense to that and do something about it. So verse 12, and Achish trusted David, thinking that he had made himself an utter stench to the people of Israel. So Achish was totally fooled by David and his antics. And Achish thought that David, after he believed what David said, that he shall always be my servant. So Achish thought he had David in his pocket. But basically, David had Achish where he wanted him. And so that's the end of this chapter. And we see an attitude. I go back and ask the same question I asked a couple of weeks ago. Where was this man after God's own heart? What happened to him in these two particular chapters? We do know that he was in a lot of stress, and being chased for 7+ years by Saul. He was bothered. It was really trouble. Now, I tried to, when we first talked about Mr. Wearsby's comments, I made the comment that God's will keeps on unfolding on his own time frame. David, in these two chapters, his faith was wobbling, kind of like I'm wobbling up here a little bit. he was in a pretty tough spot. He was tired, the anxiety that he was going through, all of the people he was responsible for. He was looking for quick answers, and he didn't want to wait on God. He didn't have the patience to wait on God. Another comment, and I think I want to close on this. When we start to look at God through our circumstances, instead of looking at our circumstances through God's eyes, we lose faith. And there's two examples here. I'm going to read that again before we close. Now, Proverbs 3:5 says, "Trust in your Lord. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding." You know, a while ago I mentioned that we were coming back to Texas. I had no idea what our life would be like. We were happy and comfortable. We enjoyed South Louisiana. We enjoyed the cuisine in South Louisiana. And like I said, I really didn't think I wanted to come back to Texas and have to put up with more Texas people when we moved back. But God had a different opinion. God gave me peace about that. And I reckon I was listening, and I just tossed it up and said, "Lord, here's the question, you give me the answer." And he gave me the right answer, because we probably wouldn't be here today if we'd still be in South Louisiana. But Christ was kind of put in this situation, and look at Christ's answer. John chapter 12. "Now my soul is troubled, what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour." And that's a question. "But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." And the crowd stood there and heard it and said that it has thundered. Others said, "An angel has spoken to him." And Jesus answered, "This voice has come for you, for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." And he said this to show them what kind of death that he would be going through. So Jesus Christ, he looked for God for everything. He knew that God would answer his question. Now let's look down here with David. David, I'll go back and read that situation. In Jesus' circumstance, he was under duress. He knew that he was going to be on that cross. He knew he was going to have to pay for the sins of every human being that ever drew breath on this earth. And where did he put his focus? On God the Father. And he said, the question he asked in that verse was, "Father, save me from this hour, but the purpose I have come is for this hour that's coming up." So he knew what he was going to have to do. David tried to worm himself out and figure out his own way. He was not patient, and he wanted to resolve his own problems. So let me read this one more statement before I go. When we look at God through our circumstances, instead of looking at our circumstances through God's eyes, we're going to lose faith. That's a pretty pronoun statement, I think. And a lot of times that big I has a tendency to come out, and we try to figure out when we can't get an answer from God, we try to create our own answer and say, well, God's going to give me a pass on this. We as humans do that. And I'm glad Jesus, as the God-man, didn't do that. He knew exactly what his purpose was. David knew his purpose, being king of Israel, but he kind of wanted to get there his way and not necessarily getting there God's way 100% of the time. So that's the lesson for today.